Hi, this is Ron from Military Images Magazine, bringing to you a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to talk about a unique image and one that you have probably seen. It's been often reproduced, and let's talk about it. This is Henry A. Barnum, who is pictured as a brigadier general in the Union Army. He is showing us his wound that he received in 1862 at the Battle of Malvern Hill. It's the kind of wound that back during that time would have been considered death. It is right in the organs, that middle part of his body. The bullet entered right above the hip, passed through the abdomen, went all the way out the back. Extreme pain and discomfort. Left for dead at Malvern Hill. Somehow managed to survive. Went through several surgeries to be able to relieve the swelling and the pain, the discharge from the wound. And so the result of it was successful. Not only did he survive, but the surgery to drain that wound was fairly novel. And by 1864, the U.S. Volunteer Medical Corps was documenting the successes of these surgeries with photography. And so this image here is the result of an effort by the US Medical Corps to document successful surgeries and other techniques that were used during the war, because the medical department realized that the work that they were doing would inform future generations about interesting surgical techniques that were being developed at the time. This particular image is taken by William Bell for the US Medical Department. He was under contract to do that work. William Bell is probably not a name that's particularly known to most folks, but I believe he's the same William H. Bell who, with his brother Nephi, worked as ambrotypists in Washington, D.C., and formed their own studio called Bell and Brother in 1862. A few years later, in 1866, the studio becomes Bell and Hall as William H. Bell joined forces with an A.F. Hall. The images that they took, including the newly domed National Capitol, the scaffolding removed, exterior images, interior images of the dome. You can find them on the Library of Congress's website and other places. Anyway, back to this photograph. You can see here, now that you know the history of this photograph being used by the medical department, it also explains why you see this mirror in the background. The mirror behind Barnum is being included so that you can see the exit wound. I should say the exit of the bullet through the other side of his body. So this image has been so widely reproduced, and usually you see it in context, and rightfully so, to the medical part of the Civil War, whether it's the horrors of battlefield wounds, whether it is the novel surgeries that were being invented by doctors on the fly to save lives. This image inhabits that realm. It's used for medical purposes. It was taken for medical purposes, and 160 years later, it is still used for that purpose. Now, there is a rest of the story that I want to talk about today. It's the Henry Barnum that you don't know. We're so accustomed to seeing him showing us this wound that we forget about what else he did while he was recovering, and while this wound was still draining and he was having pain connected with it. He didn't sit out the war. He actually remained an active commander. When he received this wound, he was with the 12th New York Infantry. He was a line officer. Later on, during the war, he accepts the colonelcy of the 149th New York Infantry, and that regiment is sent a little more to the west, out to Tennessee, where in 1863 there's the Battle of Chickamauga, and then of course you have the breakout from Chattanooga and Lookout Mountain, and in November of that year of 63, you've got Lookout Mountain taking place. And the 149th New York Infantry is part of the Union forces that make that charge that goes up Lookout Mountain, goes to the crest of Lookout Mountain, the famous battle beyond the clouds, or battle above the clouds, driving Confederate forces away, allowing the breakout of Union forces. The siege is broken. Ulysses S. Grant goes on to become Lieutenant General of all Union forces, and the rest is history. Barnum is actually in the early stages of that charge. On the morning that the attack begins, he shouldn't really even be out there. He's barely able, he's suffering from his wounds, he's barely able to move. But as you often read about, he rises to the occasion. The wound does not hold him back. He refuses to be held back. He gets dressed, he gets out there, and he leads his men into battle. They have a long way to go to get to the crest of Lookout Mountain. And Barnum is out there in front, leading his men as best he can. According to the reports that I read, he's having trouble keeping up because that wound is so painful, but he's doing his best to keep in the front. He's shouting encouragement to his men as they're moving forward as part of this great Union line that's moving towards the mountain. And as they're approaching a creek, getting to the foot of the mountain, this is when a rebel bullet strikes him in his sword arm, in his right arm. And at that point, he is completely debilitated. He's already exhausted from marching and trying to keep up with the men, and from leading and yelling encouragement. That bullet to his sword arm, doesn't make that charge up the mountain, but he does encourage those men. And I want to believe that the encouragement that he shouted, his leadership during the early part of the battle, helped fuel the Union Army to victory that day. So, word of his gallantry, word of his courage, makes it up to the general commanding the Union Army, the Cumberland. That's George H. Thomas. And a month later, as Barnum is recovering from his injury to his sword arm, still experiencing pain in his abdomen and hip from the Malvern Hill wounds, Thomas gives him the high honor of carrying the captured Confederate flags taken during Lookout Mountain to Washington, D.C., to be delivered to the Adjutant General's office. So Barnum takes on the honor, he takes on the special mission, and he delivers the flags to Washington. Of course, it's not an easy trip for him, and he suffers very much from the trip, but he does it. Miraculously, he goes back to his regiment, is wounded again during the Atlanta campaign at Peachtree Creek. And that sort of sidelines him for a little while longer. But again, he returns to his regiment, and he musters out. He resigns his commission in 1866. By that time, he's a brigadier general, and he has a brevet as a major general. He's pictured here wearing his brigadier general star. So now you know the rest of the story about Henry A. Barnum of the 12th New York Infantry, the 149th New York Infantry. Oh, and there's one more detail. In 1889, a grateful nation honored him with the Medal of Honor. Now you know the total story of Henry A. Barnum. So thanks for listening, and until the next video, happy trails.